James had always believed in the sanctity of family. Growing up in a small town, where Sunday dinners were an unspoken rule and every milestone was celebrated together, he thought his family would always have his back. His parents had raised him with strong values: loyalty, love, and the belief that no matter what, family came first. That belief made what happened all the more devastating. It began subtly, with Emily's distant behavior. At first, James attributed it to stress. They had been married for 5 years and life had grown busier. James worked long hours at the software company where he was a project manager, often bringing work home in hopes of securing a promotion. Emily, a freelance graphic designer, managed their home and took care of their son, Ethan, who had just turned 3. Their life wasn't glamorous, but it was steady at least. That's what James thought. Emily started spending more time outside the house, claiming she needed fresh air or inspiration for her work. When James suggested they spend a weekend away together, she brushed it off, saying she was too busy. Her phone became a near-permanent extension of her hand, always tilted away from James whenever a message came through. James, ever trusting, didn't question her too deeply. He believed in giving his wife her space, trusting that any rough patch would pass. But one evening, a seed of doubt was planted. They were at a family barbecue at his parents' house, a lively affair with children running around the backyard and adults laughing over beers and grilled burgers. James noticed Emily and his cousin Brian sitting close together on the patio. Brian leaned in, whispering something that made Emily laugh, a laugh James hadn't heard from her in months. It was nothing overtly inappropriate, but it stuck with him. Brian had always been the charming one, the golden boy of the family, but James brushed off the unease. Surely he was reading too much into it. The doubts, however, didn't stop there. Emily's absences became more frequent, and she started dressing up for outings she claimed were work-related. One evening, while cleaning up after dinner, James accidentally knocked over her purse. Among the scattered contents was a hotel keycard. His heart sank. Confronting her wasn't easy, but he forced himself to stay calm. When she came out of the shower, he held up the keycard and asked, "What's this?" Emily froze, her towel clutched tightly around her. "It's not what you think," she said hastily, her face pale. James pressed her for answers, his voice trembling. "Then, what is it, Emily? Why do you have this?" After a moment of silence, she broke down, admitting to an affair but omitting one crucial detail: who it was with. She insisted it was a mistake, something that wouldn't happen again, but her vague answers only deepened James's suspicions. The betrayal was a knife to the gut, but James wasn't ready to walk away just yet. He wanted to believe that they could salvage their marriage, for Ethan's sake if nothing else. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in their home became unbearable. Emily avoided James's questions, shutting down every attempt at communication. James began to notice other things: how Brian would conveniently leave family gatherings whenever James arrived, how his parents and siblings would change the subject if James mentioned Emily's behavior. It felt as if everyone around him was walking on eggshells. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. James had left work early, determined to spend time with his family and perhaps mend what was broken. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw an unfamiliar car parked outside. His heart raced. Quietly entering the house, he heard hushed voices coming from the living room. Peeking through the doorway, he saw Emily sitting on the couch with Brian. Their proximity, the way Brian's hand rested lightly on her knee, told him everything he needed to know. The air was knocked out of James's lungs. He stepped into the room, his voice a low growl. "What the hell is going on here?" Emily and Brian jumped apart like guilty teenagers caught sneaking out. Emily stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but James had heard enough. "It's you," he said, pointing at Brian. "You're the one she's been seeing." Brian, ever smug, crossed his arms. "James, don't make this into a bigger deal than it is." "A bigger deal?" James's voice rose. "You're my cousin, for God's sake. And you," he turned to Emily, his voice breaking, "how could you do this to me?" "To Ethan." Emily burst into tears, but Brian remained unfazed. "James, you've always been too busy with work. Emily needed someone who was there for her." The words cut deeper than any blade. In that moment, James realized this wasn't just a betrayal by his wife but by his family. His parents and siblings, who had always been so involved in his life, must have known. They had to. How else could this have been kept hidden for so long? The confirmation came 2 days later when James confronted his parents. His mother avoided his gaze, her hands twisting nervously. "We didn't want to upset you," she said. "It's family, James. We thought it was best to keep things quiet." "Best for who?" James shouted. "You let me live a lie. You let me think Ethan was my son." At those words, his father stiffened. "Ethan is your son," he said firmly. James stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" His mother's voice wavered. "James, Ethan is Brian's child." The room spun. James felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. Ethan, the little boy he had loved and raised as his own, wasn't even his. And everyone knew. Everyone except him. The fallout was swift. James packed his bags and left, unable to look at any of them. He moved into a small apartment across town and filed for divorce. His once close family became strangers overnight, blocking him on social media and refusing his calls. He was painted as the villain for abandoning his family, even though they had abandoned him long before. Alone in his empty apartment, James stared at the photo of Ethan on his phone. He still loved the boy, but the pain of betrayal was too fresh, too raw. He put the phone down, vowing to rebuild his life, even if it meant starting from scratch. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. James had left work early, determined to spend time with his family and perhaps mend what was broken. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw an unfamiliar car parked outside. His heart raced. Quietly entering the house, he heard hushed voices coming from the living room. Peeking through the doorway, he saw Emily sitting on the couch with Brian. Their proximity, the way Brian's hand rested lightly on her knee, told him everything he needed to know. The air was knocked out of James's lungs. He stepped into the room, his voice a low growl. "What the hell is going on here?" Emily and Brian jumped apart like guilty teenagers caught sneaking out. Emily stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. But James had heard enough. "It's you," he said, pointing at Brian. "You're the one she's been seeing." Brian, ever smug, crossed his arms. "James, don't make this into a bigger deal than it is." "A bigger deal?" James's voice rose. "You're my cousin, for God's sake. And you," he turned to Emily, his voice breaking, "how could you do this to me? To Ethan?" Emily burst into tears, but Brian remained unfazed. "James, you've always been too busy with work." Emily needed someone who was there for her. The words cut deeper than any blade. In that moment, James realized this wasn't just a betrayal by his wife but by his family. His parents and siblings, who had always been so involved in his life, must have known. They had to. How else could this have been kept hidden for so long? The confirmation came 2 days later when James confronted his parents. His mother avoided his gaze, her hands twisting nervously. "We didn't want to upset you," she said. "It's family, James. We thought it was best to keep things quiet." "Best for who?" James shouted. "You let me live a lie. You let me think Ethan was my son." At those words, his father stiffened. "Ethan is your son," he said firmly. James stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" His mother's voice wavered. "James, Ethan is Brian's child." The room spun. James felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. Ethan, the little boy he had loved and raised as his own, wasn't even his. And everyone knew. Everyone except him. The fallout was swift. James packed his bags and left, unable to look at any of them. He moved into a small apartment across town and filed for divorce. His once close family became strangers overnight, blocking him on social media and refusing his calls. He was painted as the villain for abandoning his family, even though they had abandoned him long before. Alone in his empty apartment, James stared at the photo of Ethan on his phone. He still loved the boy, but the pain of betrayal was too fresh, too raw. He put the phone down, vowing to rebuild his life, even if it meant starting from scratch. James's new apartment was modest, a far cry from the warm, inviting home he had shared with Emily and Ethan. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, and the silence deafening. He hadn't even unpacked half his boxes. Every time he opened one, he found something that reminded him of the life he'd lost. A framed photo of Ethan's first birthday, Emily's favorite mug, or the blanket they used to cuddle under during movie nights, all were relics of a past that now felt like a cruel joke. But James wasn't the type to wallow. He had grown up watching his father work tirelessly to provide for their family, and he wasn't about to let his heartbreak define him. If anything, it fueled him. His nights were spent researching ways to climb the corporate ladder, and his days were consumed by long hours at the office. He was determined to make something of himself, to prove to his family, to Emily, to Brian that he could thrive without them. Still, the nights were the hardest. Alone in the dimly lit apartment, James found himself revisiting every painful moment. His mind was a relentless reel of memories: Emily's tearful confession, Brian's smug face, his mother's feeble excuses. Worst of all were the moments with Ethan. He couldn't reconcile the love he felt for the boy with the knowledge that they weren't truly connected by blood. Did that make him any less of a father? He didn't have an answer, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. The few friends he had tried to be supportive. "You need to get out there," his coworker Sarah urged him one Friday after work. "You can't let them win by letting this ruin you." James appreciated the sentiment, but didn't know how to explain that it wasn't just about Emily or Brian. It was about the entire framework of trust and belonging he'd built his life around. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was existential. So, while his friends hit the bars or went on dates, James stayed home, tinkering with ideas for a startup he'd been dreaming of for years. If nothing else, he could channel his pain into productivity. Months turned into years, and slowly, James began to find his footing. His career, once just a means to pay the bills, became his refuge. He secured a promotion at work, leading a team on a major project that earned him recognition from the company's top brass. His confidence, battered but not broken, began to rebuild. For the first time since his life fell apart, he felt like he was moving forward. But success came with its own challenges. James's name started appearing in industry publications, and his LinkedIn profile was flooded with connection requests. Among the congratulations and networking messages were occasional reminders of the past: an old high school acquaintance commenting on his achievements or a distant relative liking one of his posts. Each notification brought a pang of pain, a reminder of the family that had cast him out. His family's absence wasn't just emotional, it was logistical. Holidays were the hardest. Christmas, once a time of joy and togetherness, was now just another day. James tried to fill the void by volunteering at a local shelter, but it wasn't the same. Seeing other families together only highlighted his loneliness. He thought about reaching out to Ethan more times than he could count, but always stopped himself. What would he even say? "I'm sorry your mother and I couldn't make it work." Or worse, "I'm sorry I'm not really your father." One particularly lonely Thanksgiving, James decided to channel his energy into something constructive. He began drafting a business plan for his startup, an idea he had been toying with since college. It was ambitious, an app that streamlined project management for small businesses, but James thrived on the challenge. The late nights, the spreadsheets, the brainstorming sessions, they all gave him a sense of purpose. As the years passed, James's efforts paid off. He launched his startup, juggling his day job and entrepreneurial pursuits with meticulous discipline. The early days were grueling, filled with setbacks and doubts. But James had something to prove, and he wasn't about to let anyone, least of all his family, see him fail. Slowly but surely, the app gained traction. By the third year, he had quit his corporate job to focus on the business full-time. The success was bittersweet. On the one hand, James was proud of what he had built. On the other, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had no one to share it with. His friends were supportive, but they didn't understand the depth of his isolation. Even the acquaintances he made through networking felt superficial, their interest in him tied to his professional accomplishments rather than who he was as a person. One evening, as James was preparing for a major investor pitch, he received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "It's been too long." It was from his mother. James stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He hadn't heard from her in years. The email was short and vague, filled with pleasantries and an invitation to catch up. There was no mention of Emily, Brian, or Ethan. No apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused him. Just a casual attempt to re-establish contact. He didn't respond. Despite his success, James often wrestled with his past. Therapy helped. His therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patel, encouraged him to explore his feelings rather than bury them in work. "You're carrying a lot of pain," she told him during one session. "And while your success is commendable, it won't heal the wounds your family inflicted. You need to decide what closure looks like for you." James wasn't sure he had an answer. Part of him wanted to forgive, to let go of the bitterness that weighed him down. But another part of him, a larger part, felt that forgiveness would be letting them off the hook. They had made their choice, and so had he. Over time, James found a sense of peace in the life he had built for himself. It wasn't the life he had envisioned, but it was his. He traveled more, joined a local hiking group, and even started dating again. While his relationships didn't last long, they helped him rediscover the joys of connection and companionship. By the time James turned 40, he had become a respected figure in his industry. His startup was thriving, his social circle was small but meaningful, and he had learned to embrace his solitude rather than fear it. He still thought about Ethan sometimes, wondering how the boy was growing up and whether he'd ever understand the choices James had made. But those thoughts no longer consumed him. James had found a way to move forward, even if the scars of his past would always remain. The sound of James's phone buzzing on the polished glass of his desk startled him. It was late, well past midnight, and the only light in the room came from the glow of his laptop screen. He had been preparing for a major meeting with investors the next morning, meticulously rehearsing his pitch, when the notification broke his concentration. He sighed, reaching for the phone, expecting another email or a calendar reminder. Instead, he saw a name he hadn't thought about in years: Mom. James froze, his hand hovering over the screen. It had been nearly a decade since he'd spoken to her. The last time they had talked was on that fateful day when he had confronted his family about Emily's betrayal and their complicity. After that, silence. No calls, no texts, no visits. And now, out of the blue, his mother was calling him. The phone stopped buzzing, and a voicemail notification popped up. He stared at it for a moment, his heart pounding, before reluctantly pressing play. His mother's voice filled the room, shakier and more tentative than he remembered. "James, it's me, your mom. I know it's been a long time, and I don't even know if you'll want to hear from me, but we miss you. I miss you. I heard about your success. We're all so proud of you, James. Please, can we talk? Just talk. I hope you'll call me back." She sounded older, wearier, almost fragile. But James wasn't moved. If anything, he felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. Where had this concern been when he needed it most? Where was her voice when he was sitting alone in his empty apartment, trying to rebuild his life from the ground up? The gall of it all calling now, after so much time had passed, when he had made something of himself. He let out a bitter laugh, shook his head, and set the phone down. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, James received a flurry of messages and calls from various family members. His sister emailed him, gushing about how much she missed him and how the family had made mistakes they regretted. His father sent a terse text, "Let's move on. Life's too short to hold grudges." Even Brian reached out, though his message was less apologetic and more smug. "Heard you're doing well. Maybe we should catch up." The audacity made James's blood boil. The final straw came when Emily contacted him. She sent a long, rambling email, filled with thinly veiled apologies and justifications. She wrote about how hard it had been for her to raise Ethan without him, and how she hoped they could be civil for the sake of the boy. James could barely get through the email without feeling physically ill. Civil? After what she had done to him? After she and Brian had ripped his life apart? He slammed his laptop shut, his hands trembling. What baffled James most was the timing. Why now? Why, after nearly a decade of silence, was his family suddenly so desperate to reconnect? The answer came one afternoon when an old family friend, Mark, called him out of the blue. Unlike the others, Mark had been genuinely supportive during James's darkest times, quietly checking in on him without taking sides. You know, your parents are struggling, right? Mark said after a few minutes of small talk. James frowned. Struggling how? Well, Mark hesitated. Your dad's business hasn't been doing well for years. And your mom, she's been having some health issues. Nothing too serious, but it's been hard on them. I think they're reaching out because they need help, James. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. So that was it. They weren't reaching out because they missed him or regretted their actions. They wanted something from him. Of course they did. He had seen it before, people crawling back into his life when they thought he could offer them something, whether it was money, connections, or support. But his own family, it was almost too much to bear. One evening, after ignoring yet another call from his mother, James sat alone in his living room, nursing a glass of scotch. He thought about the years he had spent clawing his way out of the hole they had collectively dug for him. The long nights, the sacrifices, the loneliness, all of it was because of them. And now, after everything, they wanted to waltz back into his life as if nothing had happened. But even as anger coursed through him, a small part of him, a part he hated to acknowledge, wondered if he should hear them out. Wasn't this what he had always wanted? For them to acknowledge their mistakes, to admit they had been wrong. Maybe this was his chance to finally confront them, to lay all his pain bare and force them to see the damage they had done. After a restless night of tossing and turning, James made a decision. He would meet with them, but it wouldn't be on their terms. If they wanted to talk, they would have to face the full weight of what they had done. The meeting was set for a Sunday afternoon at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. James arrived early, taking a seat near the window where he could watch the entrance. He wasn't sure who would show up, but he had a feeling it would be more than just his parents. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, his mother, father, and sister walked in, followed closely by Brian and Emily. James felt his stomach churn at the sight of them. Brian had the same smug look he'd always worn, and Emily. She looked older but still carried herself with an air of self-righteousness that made James want to walk out of the cafe then and there. But he stayed. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of thinking they had intimidated him. They sat down awkwardly, shuffling chairs and mumbling greetings. His mother was the first to speak. "James, thank you for meeting with us. We've missed you so much." James leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Cut to the chase. What do you want?" His father frowned. "Is that any way to talk to your family?" "Family?" James's voice was cold. "You stopped being my family the day you sided with them." He gestured toward Brian and Emily, who both shifted uncomfortably in their seats. His mother reached out, her eyes pleading. "James, we made mistakes. We didn't handle things the way we should have, but we're still your family. We want to make things right." James let out a bitter laugh. "Make things right? After 10 years of silence? After you blocked me out of your lives? And now, suddenly you want to make things right? Spare me." Brian, unable to keep quiet any longer, scoffed. "Oh, come on, James. You've done fine without us. Look at you, successful, rich. What's the big deal?" James's eyes narrowed. "The big deal, Brian, is that I loved and trusted all of you. And you destroyed that. You didn't just betray me, you erased me. And now you want back in because you think I can offer you something." Emily finally spoke, her voice trembling. "James, I'm sorry. I really am. I know I hurt you, but Ethan—" "Don't," James interrupted sharply. "Don't bring Ethan into this. I loved that boy, and you both took him away from me. You don't get to use him as a bargaining chip now." The table fell silent. His family looked at him, some with guilt, others with frustration. His mother began to cry softly, and his father looked away, unable to meet James's gaze. For the first time, James felt the full weight of his decision. He could forgive them, let them back into his life, or he could walk away for good. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but firm. "I've moved on. I've built a life without you, and I'm not going to tear it apart just because you suddenly regret your choices. I wish you all the best, but I don't need you in my life anymore." With that, James stood, leaving them sitting in stunned silence. As he walked out of the cafe, he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, he had taken control of his story. And this time, he was writing it for himself. As James walked out of the cafe, The weight of the confrontation bore down on him like a leaden sky. The sharp winter air stung his face, but he welcomed it. Each breath felt like a declaration of his freedom, an affirmation that he had reclaimed control over his life. The cafe door swung shut behind him, muffling the voices of the family he had left inside. He didn't look back. He reached his car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. For years he had rehearsed what he would say if he ever saw them again. He had imagined shouting, crying, maybe even walking out in silence. But the actual confrontation had been something else entirely raw, messy, and deeply unsatisfying. He had hoped for closure, yet all he felt was exhaustion. As he drove home, memories of the past decade flitted through his mind like snapshots. The nights spent alone in his barren apartment, the hours poured into building his business, the friendships he had forged and the relationships he had sabotaged because he couldn't fully trust anyone. He thought of Ethan, now a teenager, and wondered what kind of man he was growing into. Did he know the truth about what had happened? Did he think of James at all? The following days passed in a blur. James threw himself into work, attending meetings and managing his growing team. His company was preparing for a new product launch, and the busyness was a welcome distraction. But no matter how much he buried himself in tasks, the confrontation with his family lingered in the back of his mind, unresolved and festering. One evening, a week after the meeting, James received an unexpected package at his office. It was a small, unassuming box with no return address. Inside was a stack of old photographs, a letter, and a small, worn-out stuffed bear. The bear stopped him cold. It was Ethan's, one James had bought for him on his first birthday. The sight of it brought a lump to his throat. He unfolded the letter, recognizing his mother's neat, looping handwriting. The letter began with an apology, but it was unlike any of the messages or calls he had received before. This time, it wasn't about justifying their actions or asking for forgiveness, it was about acknowledging the depth of their betrayal. His mother wrote about her regrets, her sleepless nights, and the pain of watching her family fracture under the weight of their choices. "We failed you, James," the letter read. "I failed you. I thought I was protecting the family, but all I did was destroy it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." At the bottom of the stack of photographs was one that made James's breath catch. It was a recent picture of Ethan, standing next to a basketball hoop, grinning ear to ear. He was taller, leaner, but his smile was the same bright, full of life, and unmistakably Ethan. On the back of the photo, someone had written in neat block letters, "He still remembers you." James sat back in his chair, staring at the photo. For years he had avoided thinking about Ethan, telling himself it was easier to let go than to confront the pain of losing him. But now, with the boy's image staring back at him, something inside James shifted. He couldn't ignore the ache in his chest, the longing to know the child he had once loved as his own. The next day, James called his therapist, Dr. Patel, and scheduled an emergency session. Sitting across from her in the quiet, comfortable office, he poured out everything: the confrontation at the cafe, the letter, and the photo of Ethan. He spoke of his anger, his sadness, and the guilt he felt for walking away from the boy. "What do you want, James?" Dr. Patel asked gently. "Not what they want or what you think you're supposed to do. What do you want?" James didn't have an answer right away. He sat in silence, staring out the window as the question hung in the air. What did he want? Closure? Reconnection? Revenge? None of it seemed clear. Over the next few weeks, James wrestled with the question. He reread the letter, stared at the photo, and thought about his life. He thought about the years he had spent building walls around himself, isolating himself from the people who had hurt him. Was he truly happy, or had he just become good at surviving? One Saturday morning, James made a decision. He packed a small bag and got into his car, driving 3 hours to the small town where his family still lived. He hadn't called ahead, hadn't told anyone he was coming. He wasn't sure what he was looking for: answers, perhaps, or maybe just a sense of closure. He parked outside his parents' house and sat there for a moment, gathering his courage. The house looked the same, though the paint was peeling, and the garden was overgrown. He walked up to the front door and knocked. His mother answered, her face pale with surprise. "James," she breathed, her eyes welling with tears. "You came." "Is Ethan here?" James asked, cutting to the point. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, just as he remembered. His father was sitting in the living room, his face a mix of shock and guilt. James ignored him, his focus solely on Ethan. "The boy, no." The young man came down the stairs, his footsteps hesitant. When he saw James, his eyes widened in recognition. "James?" he said softly. James nodded, his throat tight. "Hey, buddy." Ethan's face broke into a grin, and before James could say another word, the boy threw his arms around him. The hug was tight, almost desperate, and James felt years of pain and longing melt away in that single moment. They spent the afternoon talking about school, basketball, and Ethan's dreams of becoming an architect. James listened intently, marveling at the young man Ethan had become. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of connection, of belonging. As the sun began to set, James stood to leave. His mother followed him to the door, her face lined with worry. "Will we see you again?" she asked. James hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe," he said, "but this isn't about you. It's about Ethan." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you, James, for giving us another chance." James didn't respond. He walked out to his car, the photo of Ethan still tucked into his pocket. As he drove away, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, hope, and a cautious sense of peace. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years he felt ready to face it. Not as a man defined by his pain, but as someone who had reclaimed his story. And that, he realized, was enough.